First of all, the title that I chose at the very beginning was from Walt Whitman's Song of Myself. Whitman happens to be one of my favorite poets. I have a lot of favorite poets, but Whitman is one of them. And this is a fragment of a line from Song of Myself. And to die is different from what anyone supposed. I'd like to finish the quote at the end. I would like to start with Shakespeare. And the reason I want to do that is because Shakespeare puts the question perhaps more eloquently than anyone else has, but he also puts it more pessimistically. And the reason I have divided this into body, soul, and with Shakespeare a dotted line with a question mark afterwards is because in some of his more eloquent statements of this, it's fairly obvious that his characters, at least, did not know what happened after death. Let me give you an example of this from Claudio's speech in Measure for Measure. Let me set this up for you. Claudio has been, how should we say, accused of, convicted of adultery. The ruler of this particular city has gone off and left his second-in-command in charge, and his second-in-command is very moralistic. Well, Claudio's sister is a nun. Claudio's sister goes to this ruler, the second-in-command, and begs for her brother's release from prison. And in the irony of Shakespeare's play, the second-in-command says, well, I'll do it under one condition, that you have sex with me. I'm putting it in less poetic language. Now there's the... there's the irony of it because her brother is accused of adultery, of having sex outside of marriage. And so Claudio's sister goes to prison and, again, in somewhat less poetic, less Shakespearean language, says, do you know what he asked me to do? And she tells him, and he says, oh my God, but, actually, that would only be one time, but, I'm being executed, and that's forever. And he puts it this way, aye, but to die and go we know not where, to lie in cold obstruction and to rot. This sensible warm motion to become a kneaded clod, and the delighted spirit to bathe in fiery floods, or to reside in thrilling region of thick-ribbed ice, to be imprisoned in the viewless winds and blown with restless violence round about the pendant world, or to be worse than worst of those that lawless and in certain thought imagine howling. 'Tis too horrible, the weariest and most loathed life that age, ache, penury, and imprisonment can lay on nature is a paradise to what we fear of death. So his idea is, and that not going to heaven, but perhaps just lying forever in the earth, a kneaded clod. Or perhaps this spirit that we have that enjoys life so much, to bathe in fiery floods, reside in thick-ribbed ice. I mean, if hell is hot, heaven must be cold, sort of frozen in the tundra or something like this. Or perhaps to just sort of blow around as a restless spirit. Or worse, just imagine howling for eternity. Well, I mean, for heaven's sakes, if any one of these alternatives is plausible, you want to stay alive as long as possible, right? But notice, here's this uncertainty, because we really don't know. Most of my colleagues at Oakland University are materialists. So the timeline of the materialist, which is one of the answers to Shakespeare's question, the timeline of the materialist is a very simple one. We are body, and that's it. When the brain goes, consciousness stops. Well, stop and think a little bit about this view. First of all, it's disturbing to many people, partly because consciousness seems to be so immediate. We can't imagine consciousness going out, because consciousness is what we imagine with. Imagine yourself without consciousness. You can't do it, right? But stop and think about this view. Some materialists have taken this as a very hopeful thing. When you die and consciousness stops, you have nothing to fear because there's nothing left to fear with or fear of. So there's a kind of a hopeful aspect. It eliminates the question here. The plug's pulled, that's it. And so you don't have to worry. Now, you might survive in some other way, and there are attempts to try to, what shall we say, prettify or poeticize this view. Here are a couple. A Jewish rabbi. Life and death, a twisted vine sharing a single root. A water bright green, stretching to top a twisted yellow, only to wither itself as another green unfolds overhead. One leaf atop another, yet under the next, a vibrant tapestry of arcs and falls, all in the act of becoming. Death is the passing of life, and life is the stringing together of so many little passages, or passings, excuse me. All right, well, there you have the notion that life and death are intertwined, that life itself is a process of constant regeneration, right? So that there are cells dying and other cells being born. There's this constant going on. And so that it looks really poetic and nice, isn't it? So we don't have to really think about fear about death because we're doing it all the time. It doesn't really satisfy the average person. He says, oh, okay, yeah, but see, I mean, I want to know what happens when there's dead. Or this one. Do not stand at my grave and weep. I am not there. I do not sleep. Sorry, Shakespeare. I am 1,000 winds that blow. I am the diamond glint on snow. I am the sunlight on ripened grain. I am the gentle autumn rain. When you wake in the morning hush, I am the swift, uplifting rush of quiet birds in circling flight. I am the soft starlight at night. Do not stand at my grave and weep. I am not there. I do not sleep. Now this is an interesting view. This is the view that you find in Chuang-Tzu. When Chuang-Tzu went to Liezi, or, well, this is an imaginary meeting, and the latter was dying, and he said, don't disturb me, I'm watching the great transformation. What shall I become? Will I become a rooster? Or say my arm will become one thing, or my eyes will become another thing, and so on. All right, that's the view of Joyce Fawson, that we somehow go back into nature. That doesn't satisfy me. I want to know if I don't want to become starlight and snowflakes and things. I want to survive, right? Right? So this is very poetic and all the rest of this, but it really doesn't satisfy us. This is the sort of thing that you read at a funeral to try to give some solace to people when you haven't the foggiest idea what happens. Okay, so there you have a view which can be optimistic if you really stop and think it through, but which doesn't satisfy most people. We're left with this question. So along come the Christians, fundamentalist Christians. I don't think Jesus taught this, obviously. I don't think St. Paul taught this. But people have interpreted Christianity this way. I'm simplifying, oversimplifying these things to make it easier to understand. And you have the view that at the end of our life, we have a choice. It depends upon how we lived our life or which Savior we have accepted in some way or other. There are a number of different theories about this in the different theologies, but either we go to heaven or we go to hell, and this is forever, right? We're always in heaven, we're always in hell. Now, a theologian will say that this isn't forever in the time sense. This is in eternity, so that there's no passage of time, so that when you're suffering in hell, it's just one moment. Yeah, that's a lot of fun. Right. I mean, you're just sort of momentarily forever, momentarily out of time in this thick-ribbed ice or burning fire or howling or whatever. So that's not a very desirable alternative. You'd like to go to the other place. And what do you do there? Well, gee, I don't know. I guess there's pearly gates and streets of gold, and you play harps and things like that and whatnot. Notice what's happening. You have Christian materialism. The notions of heaven and hell are essentially materialistic notions, aren't they? This is what Chogyam Trungpa referred to as cutting through spiritual materialism. We project onto this afterlife our ideas of this life. And so, in a sense, what we're trying to do is prolong what we already are, and we imagine heavens and hells in this kind of way. I don't know if you remember, what was it, a few years ago, there was some fellow in Illinois who predicted the end of the world on a specific day, and he had a small group of disciples who believed him, who gathered around, and they interviewed one on television. I remember seeing this. I remember this very well. Here was this fellow preparing to be lifted up into heaven bodily. He was going to be lifted up. I don't know exactly how far you go before you reach heaven. And I've always thought it was terribly unfair to the Australians because they were going the other direction. In any event, they're going to be lifted up into heaven bodily. And he was surrounded with all his priceless possessions, one of which was a television set. He wanted to make sure that he would take it along with him. And I always wondered, which channels was he going to get? And how was he going to plug it in? You see, materialist. He couldn't break through his materialistic ideas. Now, in the spiritualist movement in the 19th century, what they usually have is that the continuity is very much like our life at the present time. That we are pretty much after death as we are now, and we form alliances and we do various things. I remember talking to one psychic who felt that we would be doing social work, or we'd be doing various other sorts of things. And some of the spiritualists even assumed that we would be interacting with our beloved ones on earth. We would visit them and so forth. But this presumably goes on forever. You continue on in this. Now, more recently, some scientists have been investigating the near-death experience. There are people who have been pronounced clinically dead and then have been resuscitated. Now, in many of these instances, there is some sort of a heart attack or an accident or something else like this, and the identification of having died is that the person is not breathing and you don't get any heartbeat. And during this time that they are, quotes, dead out, they describe interesting experiences. Many of them describe an out-of-the-body experience. They describe going through some sort of a dark tunnel or valley or space, and then they come into an area which is at best described as light, and they meet a being who is a warm presence or a being of light. Raymond Moody is the one who talks about this as beings of light. Many of the researchers try to avoid theological implications of this and talk about it in general terms. And the general implication of this is that when you don't have a near-death experience, but what would we call it, a far-death experience? I mean, when you aren't resuscitated, when you really make it, that's where you're going, because you've been there before. So the assumption is that everyone goes, there goes hell, no problem about that. It's a very optimistic view, isn't it? So here you have a number of different views. Which of these are true? Do we really know? Are we in the same level of uncertainty that Claudio starts and ends with? We don't know. But there are a number of other parapsychological phenomena. Mediumistic communications are really not a very reliable evidence for anything. So I'm going to skip that. But there are the haunting cases or the apparition cases, and there is the out-of-body experience. The reason I don't have any notes is because my first Theosophical lecture, I had an out-of-body experience, and it was at Akbar Lodge. And I don't think Akbar Lodge knows about that because I didn't want to talk about it. I was terribly embarrassed. I had written out my lecture, and I was walking around rehearsing this. So when I got up to give the talk, obviously I was bored with it. And I'm sure the audience was too, and we were just going through this exercise in politeness. Nobody wanted to get up and walk out, and I couldn't. Well, I couldn't physically, but I did astrally, if you want to call it. Right in the middle of it, I had an out-of-body experience and found myself standing off to the side looking at myself giving the talk. And I thought, wow, this is interesting. How did I get out here? I wasn't terribly, surprised or worried about it. But one thing did bother me. My body quit giving the talk. I was reading. And the reaction of the audience was not your reaction. It was unease, restless. What the hell is going on here? What's wrong with him? Why did he stop? All of a sudden I was back together again, looking out of my eyes. That's the only way I can put it. Looking out of my eyes at the page, and I hadn't the foggiest idea where I was in the talk. Well, there was a paragraph that started about 4 or 5 lines down, and I figured, well, if I haven't gotten to that paragraph, at least I don't skip too much, and I hope I don't repeat too much, so I'm going to start there. And I had about 2 or 3 seconds to make that decision, and I started there, and when I ended, I got out as fast as possible, because I was embarrassed. And that's why I don't write out my talks anymore. I want to stay together. But there's one suggestion that there's something other than the physical body. When you experience that, it's very difficult to believe that you are only this, isn't it? It's very difficult to believe that. Then there's the experience of people who have had some visitation from a beloved one shortly after death. And my favorite story is of a delightful, wonderful theosophist named Alexandria Potter, whom we all called Zena. She used to come to convention regularly with her sister Ida Beller. Zena was a slender little lady and just very, very sweet. Ida was a roly-poly woman, and she was short and also very sweet. Double Scorpio, one of the sweetest temperaments I have ever known. Scorpio has a bad reputation in my estimation. But when Ida's husband died, she would report this, that for a week afterwards, when she went to bed, she would feel her husband snuggling up in bed next to her. Now, most people, if they had a tactile apparition like this, would run screaming naked into the night, wouldn't they? Not Ida. She rolled over and said, "Now, Billy, you're dead. You don't belong here anymore. Go away." And I used to chastise her. I said, what a terrible thing to do to your husband, to kick him out just because he didn't bring his body along with him. And she would look at me like I was nuts. No, he was dead. He should go on. Well, when Ida was getting along in years, she went to move in with Zena. And she had a little room in Zena's little house, had her own room, and she had weak bladder, so she would get up frequently in the night, and you could hear the springs. Zena would report this, hear the springs, and she would make noise in the closet with the hangers would clutter and things like this. Well, pretty soon Ida became so unsteady on her feet that she would fall, and poor little Zena couldn't pick her back up. She had always have to go to the neighbors to get a couple of strong men to hoist her back on her feet. So they put her in a nursing home, and at 93 or so, after about a year in the nursing home, she died. So Zena went, got all of her clothes, brought them back to the little room in Zena's house, and guess who showed up that night? Zena, in the middle of the night, heard the springs going, 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 going. She heard the clothes hangers rattling, so what did she do? It runs in a family. She went into the doorway, she stood there, said, "Now, Ida, you're dead. You don't belong here anymore. Go away." And it took her about a week to get rid of Ida, just as it had Ida to get rid of Billy. Okay, well, here you have these kinds of experiences which lead you to believe that something survives. But this something could just as well be the Shakespearean something, because one of the views is that after death there is this kind of apparitional being which continues for a time and then gradually decays and fades away. I want to investigate this a little bit more in terms of the Chinese view, but gradually decays and fades away. You'll find this in Plato's Phaedo. Socrates is supposedly the interlocutor, and Socrates is in prison for heresy, for corrupting the morals of the youth. He asked questions. The people of the day don't like any more than they do of today, don't like their views challenged. And so he was thrown in prison, and because it was a religious holiday, to simplify things, he couldn't be executed right away. He had to stay there for a while. And his disciples would come and have conversations, philosophical conversations. On the last day, he was supposed to drink the hemlock at sunset. On the last day, his disciples came early, and he decided to use this as an occasion to investigate the question of life after death, of survival. I mean, what better? I mean, he's about ready to do it, right? And so here he is. All the disciples are weeping and all the rest of it. He's very calm. He goes through this philosophic discussion that says, all right, here. And then he lies down. And he describes his feet are getting cold and so forth. And then, just as he's about ready to die, he takes the sheet and covers himself up. And then he pulls it back down and says, oh, by the way, I owe a cock to Asclepius. See that it's paid. You had to make a contribution to the God of healing. And he felt that he was being healed. Pulled the sheet back up and died. Interesting. But in the process, they investigate a number of different views, and one of them is that view, that maybe there is a kind of a something or other that survives for a while and gradually breaks up. And that's not a very satisfactory view either. Okay, well, here are a number of views. We're laughing at them, I'm laughing at them, but a lot of people believe them. And if we're going to have different views, we'll have to ask why. What are these other views? And if these are unsatisfactory, what's more satisfactory?
The following program was produced by the Theosophical Society in America.
Just to remind you of what we covered last time, a couple of days ago, I was trying to give a rather simplified view of a number of different attitudes that we have about life and death. And these are basically, I suppose you might sum them up as a Western orientation. And I'd like to look at an Eastern orientation today. Eastern ideas. And so I have similar kinds of timelines or diagrams here. I'd like to sort of go through each one of them. And then when we get to the end and I talk about the theosophical views, see whether there's any elements in these that are plausible. See if maybe each one of them perhaps has some germ of truth, though not the whole of the truth, even perhaps the materialist view. Okay, the Chinese view is one that involves two forces. Now, many people call these yin and yang, but strictly speaking, if you look carefully, it's yin qi and yang qi. It's two aspects of a kind of force, primordial or universal force, qi. It is suggested perhaps that qi may be related to prana, may be related in some other way to theosophical concepts, but we'll leave that aside for the moment. The two get intermingled in the incarnation. Remember that yang, heavenly, bright, sometimes masculine, positive, is not better than yin, earthly, dark, feminine, passive. The two of them are absolutely necessary for health. the balance of the two. I mean, not just physical health, but mental health and so forth. It's a balance of the two. If you have an excess of yang, you get sick. If you have an excess of yin, you get sick. Now, at the moment of death, the yin and the yang separate. The yang element goes to heaven, which is its rightful place. And the yin element goes to earth, which is its rightful place. So we have two souls. We have two souls. We have a yang soul and a yin soul. And we must bury the yin element, the yin soul, in the earth appropriately. When it dies, the yin element is called the po. So the po is the part of the soul that's buried in the earth. And it's very important for the po to be buried appropriately, because if it isn't buried appropriately, it can wander around and become a gui, this is pronounced as a G, a gui, a hungry ghost. And you want to avoid hungry ghosts. So you hire somebody who is called a feng shui expert. Literally all it means is wind water. And he has these elaborate kinds of charts and diagrams and compasses and so forth. And he figures the various currents of qi in the earth. And he finds a place where the currents are such that the po will remain in the earth and not go wandering around. The yang qi, or the yang element, goes to heaven and becomes a hun, a spirit. Now, if it receives the appropriate kinds of sacrifices, usually once a month, sometimes on the full moon, it will become a shen, or a benevolent spirit. And the Chinese will keep a placard, sometimes with just writing, occasionally nowadays with a photograph, about this ancestor in either a place in the home or in a temple or both. And they will go and make offerings to this spirit. Offerings of food, various other sorts of things. And they believe that this hun, or perhaps even if you're so lucky it becomes a shen, they believe this can have an influence on the earth. Now, heaven is arranged like a Chinese bureaucracy. It has Shangdi, which may be the deification of the first Shang emperor, now raised to godly status. But basically, for our purpose, we just call it God with a capital G. And then it has a bureaucracy of other kinds of gods below that, many of whom were actually human beings. Some of them mythological figures and so forth. But there's a hierarchy here. And if you have a really pious ancestor, he can kind of get the ear of one of these bureaucrats, who will then get the ear of some other bureaucrat, who might get the ear of Shangdi, and then you can get a favorable marriage for your daughter, or a successful business venture, or cure an illness or something else like this. Very, very practical. And so this is the way they go about it. Now, how do they get the prayers up to heaven? Nifty. You write it on a piece of paper and then burn it. I mean, the smoke goes up. That's the way you get it up there. And they have, apparently they believe that these hun, or perhaps shun, need some kind of sustenance, need some kinds of, there's commerce there. So they need money. So you have spirit money. Obviously, it's sort of like monopoly money. It's not real money. And you take this monopoly money to the temple, you burn that too. So it has something to buy things with in heaven. Notice how anthropomorphic this all is. But notice also an interesting feature of it. The idea that there is a kind of thing that survives that is connected with the earth, and then there's other elements that survive that's more rarefied and leaves contact with the earth, but may have some influence on it. And it sounds very much like certain theosophical concepts, though rather oversimplified and not fully developed. So here you have another attitude. Now this very much influences the way the Chinese behave. But another interesting feature about this is it goes with a dotted line and then it dies out. Because it is felt that you can keep these alive for a long period of time. Now, you don't want the yin element to stay alive for a long period of time. It's nice if it sort of goes back to the earthy element and just disappears. If you don't bury it successfully, then it's likely to stay around a little longer and it might bother you. But you want to keep the yang element around as long as possible to become a favorable influence. If you quit doing the ancestral sacrifices, it gradually peters out. So that you have this idea that eventually these just sort of die out. They're not forever. Okay, the Jain system is a very interesting one. I'm just making one line where the Jain notion of the human being is a much more complex thing. But basically, each of us is inhabited by a life unit, a jiva. Jiva literally means life. It's a unit of life, spark of life, whatever you want to call it. And the jiva gets enmeshed in matter. Well, no, that's not entirely true. It doesn't get enmeshed. It's always been enmeshed. The world has no beginning, and it will have no end. So we have always been here, which is, I think, a good reason for trying to get out of it. I mean, if we've been around for a very long time. And the jiva is such that when it is enmeshed in matter, it's weighed down by matter. The jiva is naturally light. And the metaphor in Sanskrit is really beautiful because it is exactly the same ambiguity that you have in English. Light means both brilliant and buoyant. So it is naturally luminous, and it is also naturally buoyant. It is weighed down by its encasement in matter. And when it's weighed down, what happens is, as we act, as we do various actions, there's a flow in through the senses, an ashrava, in through the senses of karmic matter. This is a very materialistic system. Karma is thought as a kind of dirt. And it covers over the soul and weighs it down and makes it dull, so that the natural luminescence or brilliance or omniscience of the jiva cannot manifest itself. And also, of course, it can't float. It gets held down. Now this means at the moment of death, one has to take immediate reincarnation. The jiva must immediately reincarnate in some form or other. Because if it didn't, it would be freed from matter and it would float up to heaven. And that isn't the way you get to heaven. You get to heaven by getting rid of the karmic gunk that covers over your soul, by refining it so that the soul can manifest its natural brilliance, its inherent purity, and its buoyancy more and more until there's just tiny little bits of this karmic matter left. And then you get rid of the last little bit of karma by not doing any more action. And that means, of course, not taking any more food, so that you starve yourself to death and then up you go to the top of the world. The world is conceived in the form of a cosmic man. And you go up then to the crown chakra of this cosmic man, and you exist there in isolated, shining splendor. But this is an interesting one, and it suggests, again, that you have a reincarnation added to this system, but that's a very different kind of reincarnation. The soul must reincarnate absolutely immediately. There can't be one muhurta, one kshanika, one instant between the death or the release of the jiva from one body and its incarnation into the next. Now, not all Jain's behavior fits this model, but basically this is the theory. There is a shloka or half a shloka in Jain literature that says, "Only he knows one thing who knows everything, and he who knows everything knows one thing." In other words, the only way you're going to be absolutely certain, for sure of anything, is when you attain omniscience. And that means that the only people who are absolutely certain of something are the ones who have released and are up in the crown chakra of the divine man, and they can't reach us anymore. So you have to do the best you can with the teachers who have gotten most of their karmic gunk released, and who are able then to give you at least a pretty good idea of what the truth is. This is what in philosophy is called the doctrine of internal relations. All right, let's stop and think a little bit about it. It's an interesting idea. In order for me to know any one of you, or you to know me, with some degree of certainty, you'd have to know my parents. You'd have to know the environment that I grew up in. You'd have to know something about my ideas and so forth. And I think all of us realize that we don't even know ourselves that fully. But in order to know our environment and our parents, we'd have to know their environment and their parents. But in order to know all of them completely, we'd have to know all of their contexts. And you can see that all of a sudden, in order to be absolutely for sure, you have to know everything. Because everything is related or interrelated with everything else. Now, this is a kind of a pluralistic doctrine of relations. There's what they call doctrine of internal relations. Many philosophers take a doctrine of external relations. You know, I can know this chair. I don't have to know the guy who made it. I don't have to know all about plastics and all about aluminum and all the rest of that sort of thing. Maybe I have to know a little bit, but I don't have to know everything. And that leads me out to knowing all about mineralogy and all. Again, all of a sudden you're out into knowing everything. So the Jains take this in a very interesting way. You'd have to be somewhat humble and tentative about your knowledge, wouldn't you? Because obviously you're not omniscient. And so they have developed a doctrine called syadvada. Syad literally is the optative of the verb to be, so it means maybe. I mean, literally, maybe. It's the maybe doctrine. So maybe this is a chair and maybe it isn't. Maybe it both is a chair and isn't. Maybe it neither. Well, it doesn't go to that, but maybe it's a chair and is ineffable. Maybe it isn't a chair and is ineffable. Maybe it both is a chair and isn't a chair and is ineffable. I mean, how do all right, stop and think about that. What makes it a chair? We sit in it. Suppose I need to reach a light to unscrew it. Now all of a sudden it becomes a step stool. So, you know, is it a chair? Is it well, okay, well, you got that. They even turn this then upon Jainism. Maybe Jainism is true and maybe it isn't. Maybe it both is true, you know, from one point of view and not true from another point of view, and maybe it's ineffable. And that means they become very tolerant. Now that's, I think, what we ought to do about Theosophy. Maybe it's true and maybe it isn't. Anyway, and you certainly ought to do it about this stuff. Maybe it's true and maybe it isn't. The Hindu view, I'm oversimplifying this. If you look at the Upanishads, you see clearly that the basic reality is atman, usually translated self. Many people feel it may be cognate with the German atman, to breathe, and it may be related to other concepts of the soul, but by the time you get to the Upanishads, it has become a metaphysical concept, and it is the basic reality that underlies what we call our consciousness. Atman then is unchanging and continues forever. It's unbeginning and unending. Jiva is a life principle. Jiva is Atman plus ignorance, ajnana, or avidya. It is dumb Atman, so that it is only Atman, but it is unaware of its Atman nature. There's only one thing here. And it becomes embodied. It takes incarnation, so I've had him sort of wrapped up in the body. And then when the body dies, it goes up to heaven or goes through various afterlife states. Sometimes the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad and others will talk about the path of the sun and the path of the moon. And the path of the moon brings you back to incarnation. The path of the sun leads you off to enlightenment. But I think that most of us are on the path of the moon. We keep coming back and back and back, however bright we may be. And then the jiva gets wrapped up again and so forth and so forth and so forth until it attains to self-realization. And then all of this just disappears. Well, the body obviously rots. But the jiva is the atman. And so the jiva simply disappears. It becomes what it is. Now, there's a very interesting idea. It becomes what it is. So you can't attain to self-realization because the self is the only thing that's realizing and it's already realized. And this gets into all kinds of interesting philosophical problems which Shankara deftly weaves around and answers in ingenious ways. Now, the jiva is much more complex. And you will find in theosophical literature a discussion of the various different bodies. It's sometimes called the stula sharira, gross. That's this thing, the piece of meat we carry around, bones and stuff like that. And then you have the linga sharira. Linga literally means mark or sign or something like that, and it's probably the etheric double, the mold upon which the physical body is based. And then you have the sukshma or subtle sharira, body. And that is the psyche, the personality, the various things that probably persist after death, according to the Hindu. And you know, the literature is not really well developed. The Theosophical literature is very much more developed in this. It's quite vague. You ask a Hindu about this, and he says, I don't know. But the principle that carries over and sort of holds the things and dictates or modifies how we become is called the karana sharira. Now, we have taken that term in Theosophy and simply translated it literally, the causal body. Sharira, vesture, body, whatever you want to call it. Karana is causal. We also have an element that we call the anta karana. Same word, karana. Anta simply means inner or internal. And we think of it as a bridge between the lower and the higher, but that's not the way the Hindus think about it at all. It's the internal instrument, literally the internal instrument. And it's made up of 4 different things. It's made up of a consciousness, consciousness slightly modified. Chit is bear a root consciousness. This is called chitta. Chitta. The 2 words are very closely related, but they're not the same thing. And it's made up of ahankara, I-making. In other words, the I-making characteristic or faculty. It's not a sort of a thing that makes an I, like, you know, a potter makes a pot. It's the whole tendency toward egoity. And then you have buddhi. We also have manas. Manas is, as Shankara describes it, is much more what we would call kama manas. In fact, it says it has very little mind in it. It's hoping, wishing, desiring. It's what the average person does when he thinks, or thinks he thinks. I'm convinced that the average person doesn't think at all. They hope, feel, wish, believe, sort of emotional kinds of things, but never stop and ask questions. That's why we're here, because we're thinking. So that it's more than manas. But buddhi is a very interesting word, and it isn't used always in Indian philosophy the way it is in Theosophy or in the Mahatma letters. If you look at the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna's dilemma is one of buddhi. What should he do? And it seems to me that one of the best translations is insight. So you have moral insight. It's the moral insight theory. You can write 10 commandments or 2 commandments or however many. You can write a recipe of moral precepts, but no possible cookbook is going to cover every conceivable moral situation. And Arjuna on the battlefield is a man of very high moral principles. If you read the Mahabharata, you know what I mean. He's already undertaken self-exile within exile because he had to violate one of the canons that the brothers had laid down in connection with their commonly held wife, Draupadi. So and the others didn't want him to do this, but he invoked this principle. They'd laid down the rule, he would do it. And here he is, he doesn't know what to do. He's lost his buddhi. So buddhi, you see, we think of buddhi as something you can't lose. It's the vesture, the thing that makes a monad out of the evanescent atman. Anyway, you'll find various different views. And so I've oversimplified it a little bit to suggest that you have this kind of roller coaster view. And you can have time between lives, and the Hindus are not at all clear. Some feel that you reincarnate fairly rapidly, maybe even immediately. Some feel that you go out for a period of time, that you create your own heavens and hells. And of course they're psychological because you're taking your psyche with you. They're internal states. Okay, well, let's look at the Buddhist. Now I've got 2 different Buddhist views because I want to talk about Pure Land or Sukhavati Buddhism, which is very popular in China. So you have the notion that we are made up not of things. Buddhism is not a substance or noun-oriented philosophy. It's a process philosophy. We are a process, constantly changing. We are dynamic. We are moving. So even when you talk about the bodies and so forth like this, it's not exactly right. I mean, think a little bit about this physical body. We recognize each other when we go down to meals. We put food into it and all the rest of this. And we can see each other, and over the years, we see more wrinkles, a little whiter hair, all the rest of this. But we can still recognize each other because it doesn't change that fast. But it is changing. I'm taking in my environment. through air. I'm putting it back out. And if I'm nervous, I'm also putting out other kinds of environment. And if you're near somebody who has been working out very heavily and hasn't taken a shower yet, you realize that there is an aura, an odor, an odor aura. We're always interacting with our environment, aren't we? Through our skins, through our mouth, through the food. And we are a dynamic system, but we think of ourselves as an object. And we use nouns to refer to ourselves. So in Buddhism, there are the 5 skandhas. Rupa is a formative skandha, and it applies to all of the outer and inner vehicles. But many Buddhists, and this I see in writings by Buddhists, take this just to mean body. And so I've put this as a finite timeline. But I think that it's formative consciousness, so that when we die, our self-image is still there, and that's part of our self-image is our body, isn't it? And a lot of other things. So it constellates. Okay, then you have Vedana. I like this set of them. Affectional, sometimes translated as feelings, the feeling side. So that you get, see, it's very interesting not to get wedded to the senses, the astral body, the mental body, to think of it in slightly different ways. Think of it in a little bit more flexible ways, so that you can think of sensations. That reminds us of our senses. But you can also think of it as feelings. That's another possible translation of Vedana. Sanya is putting ideas together. Nya, it's from the root nya, know. We get our word know from that. So that the sanya is the things that are put together, the knowledge put together. And it sounds like constructions of thoughts. You can think of these as abstract ideas or concrete ideas, or you can think of them as both. I'm not sure that the Buddha wanted to separate the two, and so used this term. And then sanskara, which is a very interesting word. It's very much like grooves in the mind. It suggests that we have certain tendencies or habits, like a phonograph record. And when you get into a similar situation, you behave like that. That's why behaviorist psychology can be so successful. Because of the samskaras, because we're not that creative. We do kind of have predictable characteristics about ourselves. And then finally, vijnana. And this is translated by the master mental powers, or just mental here. But it isn't really so much that. Vi is a separable prefix, nya, to know, so that it suggests the kind of mind that categorizes, that separates. And it has sometimes been translated conditioned consciousness. So that when you attain, I don't know whether I'm ever going to make it, but when you attain to nirvana, what do you get? You get wisdom consciousness. And it is then prajna, is the knowledge that goes out. It's not separative, it's not divisive, it's not categorizing, it's not constantly trying to judge, and so forth. It's an entirely different, but it's the same thing. There's nothing new. That it's just the way you use these that makes them uncreative and drive you on into incarnation, or makes them under your control. Here you have this stream. That's why I put it as kind of wavy lines. It's a stream of consciousness. And this also, remember, the 1 minute then causes the next moment, which causes the next moment, which causes the next moment. We ask, yeah, but what am I? I mean, there's got to be something persisting that's I, right? Now stop and think a little bit about that. If there is something persisting, then it can't cause anything, because all causality involves change. So it's inert, futile, sterile. The Buddhist system is very much more insightful, but it's hard to understand because we are a constant, and this is true of all of these, constant dynamic system change. Following certain tendencies, certain causal patterns that we have set up within ourselves, which enable us to say that it's the same person from moment to moment. But still, it's a dynamic system. Now, some of the Buddhists in China weren't happy at all about this. And they wanted an easier route. They developed a system of all of these celestial Buddhas one of whom out of his tremendous compassion, Amitabha Buddha, out of his tremendous compassion, created with his divine powers a special heaven for his devotees, so that by just praying to him, you could go there and then you could work for nirvana, and it was a heck of a lot easier because it wasn't always distracted by advertising and so forth. Well, I mean, obviously it didn't have it, but distraction by pretty women or men or whatever. And you could then make better progress toward nirvana. This world was so debauched, there was no hope of ever getting to nirvana here, so that you have this pure land. Boy, isn't that a salvation view? And all you have to do to get there is just, in the Japanese, Nama Amitofu, Namo Amitofu, Namo Amitofu, Namo Amitofu, Namo Amitofu. And that's all you need to do. Now, some of them said you had to say it 1,000 times a day, and that's a little onerous. So some of the later ones liberalized the system a little bit, and 1 or 2 a day was good enough. And maybe even just at the moment of death, Amito, and then you can go up, and he will accept you into heaven. Now we laugh at that, and I'm really ridiculing that, because it seems to me a parody of the teachings of Buddha.
The following program was produced by the Theosophical Society in America.
I first got introduced to the idea of life after death, continuity of consciousness, reincarnation, and so forth from the writings of C.W. Leadbeater and Annie Besant. But then I started looking at the Mahatma letters, and of course that preceded Leadbeater and Besant. We had a nice tidy pattern, and I got all confused. So I will try to, clumsily I'm sure, try to lay out these two different views, and then we can talk about them, and then we can perhaps try to wrap this up. And then I also want to talk about the idea of death from a slightly different perspective or point of view. All right, now, since the theosophical view is one of rebirth, reincarnation, whatever you want to call it, you have some mechanism of persistence. And in the ABCWL view, you have an upper triad, an upper trinity, Atma, Buddhi, Manas. At least that's the way it's usually described. This continues from life to life. Now, it is also in some theosophical literature referred to as the monad, and of course monad means single, so that you have two things that make a single. It sounds at least paradoxical at first, but it isn't really, because the Atman is not so much a principle as it is resting in the one, space, whatever you want to call it, Parabrahm, and it requires something to constellate it, to individuate it, and that of course is Buddhi, so that it acts as a unit. It is comprised of, as it were, two aspects or two, however you want to call them, but it still acts as a unit, so it's a monad. But it's very frequently called the upper triad, isn't it? And so Manas is added to that. Now, you have in theosophical literature, you have a book on it, on the causal body. And what the relationship of the causal body is to Manas is not always made very clear. So I've listed it as a separate thing. It is just a translation of Karana Sharira. It's just a literal translation of the Sanskrit. And the Sanskrit theories, the Hindu theories, are not always consistent. There are numbers of different Indian philosophies, and they're not at all the same about these things. So we have just taken the term. You sometimes hear about a mental body that is different from the causal body. Presumably the causal body would be what is sometimes called the higher manas, and the mental body would be what is sometimes called the lower manas. The abstract mind, the concrete mind, the mind that analyzes and distills and gets some essences out of things, as opposed to the mind that is more dealing with specific things. Then you have books on, you have discussion of the astral body. Astral, of course, simply means starry. And as Leadbeater once explained, this is not perhaps a very good choice of words, because once you get out of the physical, all matter is more luminous. So in some sense, everything other than the physical is astral, is starry in that sense, is self-luminous. But in any event, it's associated with emotion, and Theosophists very frequently talk about it as the emotion body, body of desires, sometimes called kama body, whatever. You then have a mold or double of the physical body, sometimes called the vital body, very frequently called the etheric double. And then, of course, you have our old friend that we're carrying around that we fed before we got here, this piece of carne, which we call the physical body. Now, in some of the theosophical literature, it is even suggested that Atma is not part of the principles, and the physical body is not part of the principles. The real human being is everything else in between. And it is that which utilizes the body that has evolved from these various different kingdoms. We are sort of parasitic on this body. See, you look at these various different theosophical views and you get all confused. Wouldn't it be nice if we had a nice tidy view like the Christians have, and you just memorized it and that's the way things are? But the trouble is, these theosophists make you think. And that is very hard, especially if they're not consistent. You have to look at these in different ways, and there are different ways of presenting the thing to try to stretch your mind so you don't get locked in to a specific terminology, and that you try to get to the reality behind the terminology. These are just words. Words, words, words. Okay, that's very nifty. At the death of the physical body, of course, we realize the physical body persists for a while, doesn't it? But if it is cremated, presumably, this is the theory, the etheric double immediately evaporates. If it is not cremated, the etheric double may have a kind of a life for a period of time and may hang around, and that perhaps people at a graveyard will see some sort of nebulous, misty type of thing, and then they get all frightened about it. Although it never really seems to bother anyone or chase after anyone anyway, people get concerned about that sort of thing. The astral body is supposed to persist for a longer period of time, and there are various different ideas about this. In some of the Best and Leadbeater material, they'll talk about Kamaloka, but much more frequently you find that term in Blavatsky and in the Mahatma letters. So the astral body may last for a period of time, and this is usually, it is said, dependent upon the intensity of the emotions. It is this that gives the idea of hell. I suppose you should call it purgatory. But after a while, the astral body dies. And what happens to it? The same thing that happens to the physical body when it dies. It hangs around for a little while. It's an astral corpse. It doesn't disintegrate immediately. And so, this is the sort of thing that might communicate with a medium. And you ask yourself, do you really want to communicate with a corpse? What a dumb thing to do. Anyway, it hangs around for a period of time, and then eventually, if it doesn't get associated with some place or doesn't get associated with some medium, kept alive in some way, it too will dissipate. And you continue then in the mental body for a little while. The same thing goes through there, and then you go up, you get absorbed into the causal body. That's called Devachan, the world of the gods. And it's pretty nice. You can be there. I have a very short period of time. This is not a highly evolved soul. It doesn't have a very long Devachan, but most of us are going to, this is just a diagram. It's going to be the longest period of time. The Master K.H. even suggested to Sinnett that it might last for 2,000 years. Now, you look at the literature on reincarnation and these people who have hypnotic age regression, and they all come back within 100 years, maybe even shorter period of time. And I've always puzzled a little about this. There's a considerable discrepancy between 2,000 and 100, in case you haven't looked at that. There's a considerable discrepancy between that. In any event, whatever happens, eventually you start picking up in mental body and astral body, etheric double, and the mold forms. It's a dynamic mold, of course. It forms around the growing physical body, and then here we are back again. You're reborn. Okay, well that's one view, and the interesting thing about this view is it tends to explain a number of kinds of things. I mentioned the phenomena of mediumship. I mentioned that sometimes apparitions will seem to be the immediately deceased personality. Perhaps the etheric is still around in the astral and the mental and so forth. And then it seems to constellate a personality, seems to be intentional, and it is very short in duration. The kinds of things that you find in what are called the crisis apparitions, which tend to happen within 24 hours of the crisis that usually results in death. Sometimes immediately before, when a person is thrown out of the body, go to a loved one and say, I just died, but don't worry, it's all right. Usually what they do is just stand there and look at you, and then they disappear. And the interesting thing about ghosts is they are indistinguishable, these crisis apparitions, indistinguishable from a person who is physically present. They close, they avoid furniture, they open doors in order to get in, and so forth. In a few cases, people have had the presence of mind to notice that they are reflected in mirrors. So much for the werewolf idea. And then they have a remarkable characteristic that I've always wished when I gave a bad lecture or said something stupid. They disappear. I haven't been able to do that. So they have contradictory characteristics. They're exactly like us, but they're not at all like us. And it's at that point that the person realizes something a little strange about this character. So the stories that you see of Casper the Friendly Ghost and these kinds of things that you see on Halloween, that's not at all the way ghosts really? Well, anyway, the way ghosts are. So here you have something that kind of explains that. It also explains haunting cases, because the haunt simply is Scottish for home. It goes home. It does things that it used to do. But it's very mechanical. It can sometimes interact with the people in the environment, but much more rarely does that. It tends to just sort of go through motions that it used to do in lifetime. And we would think that it probably is most sensibly called an astral corpse. But remember, the corpse there is an emotional thing. It has certain characteristics of emotion, perhaps kama manas even. And it is capable of behaving mechanistically like its previous inhabitant, but it lacks the characteristic of individuality, willfulness, free will, and so forth. It tends to be quite mechanical, and it usually tends to fade out over a period of time, though there are reports of ghosts in English houses that may last for a couple of hundred years. It is also interesting that when these crisis apparitions or these ghosts appear to people, they don't always appear to everyone in the room. There are relatively few cases, small percentage of cases, where there's more than one person present when a crisis apparition appears. And in some instances, only the person who is the nearest and dearest will see the apparition, the other person will not. In some instances, two people or more will see it, and another or more will not. So what's going on here? It is obviously not physically present. It means that the percipient plays a role in creating the conditions for this appearance. So it's a very complex kind of situation, and it bears careful study. I think Theosophists probably have the mechanics to explain it better than others. But it is not at all a simple kind of thing. And then you read the Mahatma letters and you say, oh my gracious, now what's going on? Aside from the fact that we in the Besant Leadbeater tradition and those others who inherit it tend to count from top down. 1 is a good number, isn't it? 7 is also a good number, but it tends to be bigger and grosser, has more kinds of things about it, extra little hooch on it and so forth. So we tend to count from top down, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Whereas the masters started where we are, which is here, and counted from bottom up. Obviously, bottom, top are relative terms. I'm just using those in a loose sense. And in the Mahatma letters, they refer to the lower triad rather than the upper triad. The lower triad. And here, all of a sudden, you get a monkey wrench thrown into the works. You have the physical body, the etheric double, or whatever you want to call it, usually called the linga sharira, and prana. And you realize that prana is not a body, but is the stuff that vitalizes the bodies. It's the life principle. And as C.W. Leadbeater observes, actually it pervades all of the planes of nature and vitalizes all of them. So it's associated basically here. And when death occurs, the etheric double, to use that term, or the linga sharira, the second principle, and the third prana, last for a little time, but not long, and then tend to dissipate. Now this does not fit very easily with some other kinds of phenomena that people have noticed. But in any event, let's skip that slight detail. It probably lasts longer or shorter depending upon the person that's involved and how theosophical or how materialistic or whatever that person might be. Theosophists lose them right away. They just dissipate, right? Because we're smarter than to hang on to that dumb thing. That's not us anyway. Then you have the fifth and the fourth, or the fourth and the fifth principles, which are referred to as the lower duality. And so you have kama and manas, the desire principle and manas. And this lasts for some period of time. It's this thing that goes into the world of kama, into the kama loka, the desire area. And the master's very clear about this. This can be extremely brief for some people, Theosophists obviously. And it can be fairly long. He even suggests quite a number of years. And it depends again upon your desire. Now, let's go back and look at either of these two in terms of what our self is. When we die, we might think of ourselves as liberated, as freed from all of the troubles of keeping this piece of meat going. But another person has a self-image that is who he or she is. And quite frankly, most of us do too. How do we identify each other? By our bodily characteristics. A lot of what we think of as ourself is referred to the physical body, and you can understand these poor benighted fools who don't know any better, who take their body image with them, and their desires, their thoughts and so forth with them. And it may very well be that the materialist is right. When he dies, there is nothing, because that's his self-image. He goes into a long unconscious state. He may even dream that he's unconscious. I don't know. But it's possible that the afterlife state differs significantly from person to person depending upon what that person expects. You know the story about, you can put this in lots of different religions. I'll pick on the Baptists for the time. The Baptist who went up to heaven and he was being shown around by St. Peter, and there was this big wall along one side. And he said, what's that wall for? He said, oh, that's where the Roman Catholics are. They think they're the only ones here. But I suspect, we might we might very well do exactly that. We might wall off our afterlife and people it in according to our preconceptions. Okay, well, this lower duality then, after a period of time in Kamaloka, which might be brief and it might even be unconscious. The Master suggests that many people pass through this either relatively rapidly or unconsciously. He talks then about a gestation period. And this is the only place in theosophical literature I have ever seen any talk about this. And I must confess, I haven't the foggiest idea what he means. I've looked around in that and I have no idea. But in any way, you go through this gestation period, and he says it's very important. It might last for a fairly long period of time. And there's a struggle that goes on here between what he calls the upper duality. This would be the monad, seventh and sixth principles, Atma Buddhi, as we now call them, and the lower duality. And if the lower duality wins the struggle, what happens? This personality, this lower part, is separated from the upper part forever. He says this is a relatively small percentage. My guess is it's so small it isn't even worth talking about, and he really takes that attitude, but he wants to open it up as a possibility. And then the monad has to hang around until the next globe and start all over again. Boy, that's terrible. Who's a candidate for that sort of thing? Who would immediately come to mind as a candidate for this kind of cutting off? Most people would say Hitler. Probably not, because Hitler loved animals. And so he has that spark of something in him which would enable him to have at least a little bit of Devachan. And he did, after all, love Eva Braun. So he did have this in him. So what happens, and the master is not always absolutely clear about this, but in the Devachan letter it suggests that some of the manas, and it's necessary for them to have a Devachan, some of the manas principle goes up into, or is absorbed into this upper duality, and so it becomes an upper triad. Well, so Besson and Leadbeater are kind of right, not exactly, but sort of right, and good enough for government work. I don't know if it's good enough for inner government work, but good enough for government work. And that's the Devachan, and this lasts for an enormous period of time. And what does the master say about Devachan? It's a period of intense selfishness. But think about it. Is there anything wrong with that? It's a period of Maya. But then the master goes on and says, but that's after all what ordinary physical life is. Prolonged period of Maya. Not all that different. What happens when we go to sleep? I mean, I don't mean death here. I mean, just what happened to you last night? The Hindu view is very clear about this. We have a jagrat, or worldly, which is often translated waking state. That's more or less what we're in. Then we go to sleep and we go through a period of sort of unconsciousness, and we have a dream period. We go into this, well, let's see, I guess they usually have down for this. I would think it would be up, but anyway, most psychologists have you going down. And you go into a dream state, and then you go deeper into a deep sleep state. And then you come back out of it into a dream stage. You dream several times at night before you come back into waking consciousness, so that you have the dream and you have the deep sleep. If we don't dream, we start going a little bit crazy. If we don't have deep sleep, we also start going a little bit crazy. We have psychological problems. So we need both of these. And that's exactly what's going on here, isn't it? We go into Kamaloka, and then we go into Devachan, and we come back. We go through cycles, don't we? We have the ordinary activity cycle, and then we rest for a while. And then we get up again and have an activity cycle, and then we rest for a while. And we have this day-night waking sleep cycle. We don't have to worry about the details of the sleep cycle and the complexity of it, but just simplifying it. Then what do? We have this longer work cycle, and then we take a vacation for a period of time. Some people are unlucky, they only get 1 week. Some people are teachers and they get the whole summer off, and that's why you want to go into the academic profession. Of course, they expect you to do research during this time. You're not supposed to be completely off, but in any event, you have a vacation. Then you have the bigger cycle, don't you? You have this cycle, and then what do? You take a long vacation. Why in heaven's name would you fear death? You're getting a vacation. It's great. Look forward to it. A lot of people think it would be nice to come back and help the world, but you're giving up this opportunity for refreshment, for revitalization. And that's, after all, what sleep does to us in ordinary life, isn't it? So that's what Devachan does to the average person. Simplifying, it's more complex than that. Furthermore, if you come back too rapidly, you're going to come back with a great deal of fatigue, and you're going to have nervous problems. So don't give up your Devachan. I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to a long one. So here you have these different views. This Devachan, the gestation, the Kamaloka, and then you start coming back into incarnation again. So here you have two different views. There's similarities, and they're not all that fundamentally different, but they are different. They talk about it differently, and you'll have to ask yourself which one is right. So here I have all of these theories. You have the yin-yang theory, which fits kind of nicely with this idea. Here's the yin, here's the yang. We're a little bit more complex, but the Chinese are on the right track. The masters suggest that there is something to be said for the materialist view, at least for a materialist, not for anybody else. There is the idea that if you go into the afterlife full of desires, suppose you're a drug addict. Suppose, or perhaps even an addict for sex, a rapist or something else like this, a pedophile, and you die. You still have that astral body, don't you? And you have no way to satisfy your lust, your desires, your drives. That's hell. That's all it is. You create your own. If you're a different person, you're in purgatory or heaven. And so that's the Christian view. Of course, it doesn't stop there. You know, it keeps on going, so you come back. But there's something to be said for a lot of these points of view. And if you die very young, and the Master even mentions this in the David Chan letter, you tend to reincarnate very quickly. No, that's not quite the Jain view, but it's close to the Jain view. So these views have something to be said for them, but they aren't the whole story. What is the whole story? One of these? Well, who am I to say that this is wrong, for crying out loud? That would be presumptuous, wouldn't it? Let me just wrap this up by going back to that mantra, or mantram, if you want to cite it in the accusative singular, that we are all familiar with, and that leads to a deeper exploration of this whole topic. From the unreal, lead me to the real. From darkness, lead me to light. From death, lead me to immortality. When the focus of our consciousness is no longer here, but somewhere up in here, then death is just like taking your clothes off and going somewhere else. Do the masters dream? No, they don't need to. Their consciousness is above that. Do they go into David Chan? No, they don't need it anymore. Their consciousness is very different because the focus of consciousness is at a different level. And I suggest that when we take our earthbound, organized, self-imaged consciousness and try to understand their consciousness from our point of view, we may be making mistakes. I don't know that we can ever completely understand that until we get there. It would be like a dog, a very intelligent, highly evolved dog, trying to understand what we're doing here. As far as that dog is concerned, nothing is going on, just maybe a lot of noise, barking. So what does the dog do? In a case like, lies down, goes to sleep, and waits till there are rabbits or something else that can capture its attention. Well, we might be like that. I mean, that expansion of consciousness surely has to lead us into a different way of looking at things. So that's what we're really looking at here. These are useful theories to help give us a comfort, help us give us some feeling for continuity, so that we're not puzzled and fearful at the moment of death. But the real progress is from this whole process into immortality. That's the death we're looking for. It is a spiritual death. It is a deeper death. It is dying to ego, dying to all of this lower stuff, all of the things that give us this silly self-image that we carry around, and focus us into something else. That, of course, is what Theosophy really is, Sophia. So, you wind up with this. Walt Whitman. Has anyone supposed it lucky to be born? I hasten to inform him or her it is just as lucky to die, and I know it. That's an interesting comment, isn't it? I pass death with the dying and birth with the new washed babe, and am not contained between my hat and my boots, and peruse manifold objects, no two alike, and every one good. The earth good, the stars good, and their adjuncts all good. I am not an earth nor an adjunct of an earth. I am the mate and companion of people, all just as immortal and fathomless as myself. I love that word, fathomless as myself. Doesn't that suggest these depths that we have to explore? All goes onward and outward, nothing collapses, and to die is different from what anyone supposed, and luckier. Yeah.